This interview was recorded before coronavirus restrictions were in place. I think the best word to describe motherhood, or a series of words, is full on. The idea of having to do my job at the same time as looking after a newborn baby kind of bursts every kind of brain cell I've got. Hi, my name's Claire Newell, and I'm the investigations editor at the Telegraph. This is my first ever podcast. Welcome to the Juggling Act. Today I'm interviewing Sam Smethers at her home in North London. She has about a 15-year age gap between her older children and her younger ones. I suspect during this time she might have learned quite a lot and seen quite a lot of things change in society in terms of childcare. I'm actually quite in awe of Sam. She spent a lot of time bringing up children, but at the same time had this absolutely brilliant career. She's an expert juggler, I guess. Hello.
Hi, I'm Claire.
Come on in. Thank you.
I thought maybe we'd sit in the garden.
Yeah, that would be really nice. Actually, the sun's come out, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's not too bad.
And how old are your children? I think you've got 4.
That's Rachel and Jack, and then I've got Grace, who's 12, and Alexandra, who's 9.
And have you noticed a difference? So, for example, when you went back to work the first time with your older children, was that experience very different from when you went back to work with your 2 younger children?
Yes, very different in a number of ways. One is I didn't get as much paid maternity leave at all, and I had to go back quite quickly after both. And that's just because we didn't have generous statutory maternity pay in place then. It was actually quite a short period of time.
How long was it?
I think it was 3 months I had.
Yeah, that is short, isn't it?
Yeah, it was really short. And I went back part-time after both of them. And also, you know, the rate of maternity pay you got was pretty low. I can't remember what it was now, but it really wasn't very much. I think the positive thing to say is that the provision is much stronger and much better now for mothers returning to work after having children than it was 25, 30 years ago. And that's because of changes that were made actually by the Labour government in the 1990s and early 2000s to improve that provision. You know, I had to rely on very much on informal childcare, and again, a lot of parents still do in terms of grandparents, older siblings, you know, aunts, uncles, that kind of thing. But really, you know, I could not afford to pay for childcare. So my granddad was actually my childminder.
So that was with a 3-month-old baby he was doing that. Oh, that's impressive.
He was quite a young granddad. It's because my mum was young when she had me, and I was young when I had my first. So that, you know, he was in his early 60s. You know, I certainly couldn't have gone back to work without that, because there really wasn't much else I could rely on. If you haven't got that support in place, then you're really scuppered. And at the moment, what we're seeing is, you know, yes, we've got better childcare provision available now than we did 30 years ago, but actually the childcare sector is still really fragile, and, you know, the funding model we've got for childcare now is still really, really precarious. And, you know, we've never really thought about what do families need as a sort of wraparound service, and how are we going to fund that in a way that's sustainable.
And what did you do the second time round with your younger children? Again,
it was some informal care initially. I then got a registered childminder, so I was just earning enough at that point to afford that. It was quite busy, and I was working for MPs, so, you know, working for an MP is quite full on anyway. You know, and I was quite unusual, and, you know, not that many people in that situation have got kids. Actually, a lot of them are sort of younger without those commitments, and so they work long hours, and they're not in a position of having those constraints. But I was having to stop at a certain point and say, right, I've got to go home now. And actually in those days you couldn't either really work from home in any meaningful way. You couldn't log into your email remotely. In fact, when I was working for Bernie, we were faxing things to people. You know, that's how old I am and how long ago it was. So it's that period, I think, was quite stressful and difficult. I was quite determined though to progress. I didn't want to just not do the things I wanted to do, so I was like determined to find a way, and I think you have to be quite sort of single-minded enough to do that. But yeah, it was difficult, yeah. And we didn't equally share it. My first marriage, that was my, I've divorced to be married, but we didn't equally share it in those days. So it was very much on me.
And the second time, were you able to create a situation where you share the childcare more?
Yeah, definitely. We're much more equal parenting, and we have been all the way through. So it's a different situation, much more equally shared, and
Is that something you decided to do before having children? You agreed, okay, let's try to do 50-50, or?
I think we did sort of talk about it. I wouldn't say we agreed it. I think it's the kind of, him wanted to be much more of a hands-on dad and involved in that way, I think was pretty clear. So that's good, and that was what I wanted as well. But I don't think we ever got to a point of really dividing it up in a conscious way.
Yes.
And a lot of couples, I guess, would be the same, sort of muddling through and kind of maybe hoping, expecting, assuming, and then kind of getting a bit disappointed or pleasantly surprised at the end, whatever happens. We definitely did talk about it though, and I know I was quite clear that what had not been helpful before was that it wasn't shared.
Yes.
So that was what I needed and expected, and that I was still going to carry on with my career, and this is really fundamentally important to me. And so I voiced all of that, which is important, I think, to at least make that visible.
And with your first marriage, do you think that was particularly difficult, that it did fall to you to do the childcare, and therefore did your career suffer?
I think my career was compromised in some ways. Yes, I do. Although I still got to do the jobs I wanted to do, so I was lucky to, in the opportunities I had. I think part of that was luck. It's I definitely resented it. It is difficult, and you feel like, certainly in that world, in that political world, you feel very much like the odd one out. And I never went to the bar afterwards. I never got to do any of the socialising that other people did. But it was just a constraint of reality I just had to live with. There was nothing. I didn't have any choice about that. That was it. And I couldn't be late with the kids, and I had to be back, and that was it. So I just had to be really, really disciplined. So and I was very upfront. Bernie was always very understanding, and there was never an issue there. And actually, some of the work was very local to where I lived because it wasn't all in Parliament, so that was easy in a way. But for Andy, it was tougher because obviously I had the journey into Parliament every day, and that can sometimes go wrong, as we all know. And I just had to be very upfront with him. I remember being very upfront in the interview actually, and just saying, I can make this work, but this is how it's going to have to be. And I just had to spell it out and say, I've got to leave at 5:30 every day, can't be late. I'll do a brilliant job during the day when I'm here. I'll put in extra hours at other times when I can, but I can't miss, I can't get here before that point, and I can't be later than leaving at 5:30. And I literally just used to drop everything and go. And, he just accepted that. And he knew that I would do a good job when I was there. And we worked around it. I could do phone calls here and there in the evenings, whatever. We found a way around it. And ultimately, you just need your employer to be appreciative of that and understanding what those constraints are, and not to judge your performance based on your time in the office. And they're seeing actually people can deliver really effectively, remotely and flexibly.
And on those occasions, either in your present job or with your first children, so earlier on, did you feel guilty standing up and saying, I've got to leave now?
Sometimes, yeah, guilt is part of it. And I think, I've learned to feel less guilty over the years, frankly, and I don't feel guilt anymore. I used to feel guilty if my parliamentary job, my political job, got in the way of doing something with the kids or for the kids. That's when the guilt was stronger in that direction. So if it was something I missed, although frankly I didn't miss very many things, I was always, again, quite bloody minded about that, and just said, well, I'm not going to miss that assembly run, I'm not going to miss that sports day, whatever. And actually it was Harriet Harman who said to me, your family will always be there, they'll always be your commitment, but your job will come and go. Just remember, however important the job is, family has to come first. However important the organisation is, family comes first. And having that message from people in authority above you, or you look up to, is really powerful. So I always say it to my staff as well, because I want them to know that I care about their family, and I want them to put their family first. And I think that gives people some sense of reassurance. I can relax into that a little bit, knowing that they're not going to be judged harshly for wanting to be at the parents' evening, whatever. The other thing that is harder for women is combining that sense of wanting to care for their children, but also really wanting to pursue their career and that ambition, and that somehow feeling guilty about feeling that.
Yeah, people always talk about the guilt of not being with your children, but what about the guilt regarding work?
It's the guilt is more actually, I love my kids, but it's not enough. And actually, I really, really need to be out there doing that thing that I'm qualified to do and I'm capable of doing. And I took a long time to actually get myself to process that. Actually, it's not. There's absolutely no reason to feel guilty about feeling ambition to fulfil yourself and your potential, and that's exactly what I'd want all my children to be able to do, to fulfil their potential, and me doing that and setting that example for them.
And what do you think your kids actually think of your job?
I know they're all really immensely proud, and I hear that from them all the time. I hear that from the older ones all the time. My 12-year-old just wears it like a badge. Oh, mum, you go, you run force it, and it's really. So I think that's all really, really positive and wonderful, and you kind of beat yourself up in your own head thinking that they're going to judge you harshly for doing it, or they're going to feel hard done by. They want to be part of it, so involving them in it. I bring them into work, I bring them into Parliament, I've had my kids appear in election leaflets. I've done all kinds of stuff. But I think the one thing, and that comes back to the decision I made this year to take a step back now, that's as much for my own sense of well-being as well, and my own performance in the job, because I think you get to a point where with a job like this where you just have to know that you're not necessarily functioning as well as you were a year or two ago. It's important to know when you need to recharge yourself, and that however much you consciously balance all this stuff, it's hard. It's just hard work, and it's like attrition. It just grinds you down after a while, and so taking a step back to refresh yourself is a good thing to do.
And what do you think you found most tiring about the juggle?
I think I always think of it, I've got a lot of mental clutter. And again, loads of mums I think would say the same thing. You're thinking about so many different things at any one time. It's the worry factor. It's the sort of making sure something's done, making sure, even now I'm thinking, has Gracie left to go and pick Alex up at 12:30, and do I need to make sure she's done that? What time is it now? So Mark's upstairs, he said he'll be able to back up, but so it's those things that I just think I haven't quite stopped thinking about that as I'm talking to you, because I feel it's my job to make sure someone's at the gate to pick her up because I'm not there. And that's just, all right, it's responsible parenting, but it tends to be more on women's shoulders. It's women that do that worry all the time, right? So mental clutter, and then I've got a job where I have a lot of mental clutter as well, because as a small organisation you're kind of carrying and multitasking, and if someone's not in, if someone's off sick, you're covering that. I haven't got people I can really share it with and delegate to in any number, and you've only got to have 2 or 3 people off, and you're then really, really stretched.
Do you know, I'm constantly thinking about different stories and work, even at the weekend. And now I've got a baby, I think about him all the time as well. And then you add into that social media. Do you think that's changed the way that we work?
I think it definitely has. That feeling of always having to be switched on. And that if you're not across something quickly, if you're not tweeting about it quickly, if you're not on it, why were you so late to it? Where have you been? What have you said? Why didn't you say something? We get a lot of that, and
it sounds horrible.
It is horrible, and now again, it doesn't bother me the way it used to. I used to feel like, oh my god, I've got to make sure if I haven't said that, then I'll be looking for what has Fawcett said, and I'd be like really anxiously kind of going, oh, where's my comment? And generally we are pretty much across things when we need to be, but equally at the moment I know that if I haven't said something like on the TUC stats on childcare yesterday, somebody else will have done, and I can comment on it at some point, and it's okay. But it is, and the news agenda and the social media agenda does drive that quite heavily, and it is quite difficult, I think, to be self-disciplined enough to not look at it and to turn it off and to give yourself a break from it, like to turn it off on holiday, for example, or to tweet, I'm not going to be looking at Twitter for the next weekend. And I do that sometimes. I've been consciously doing that just to try to educate people externally as well as to stop myself doing it, because I said I'm not going to look, then I shouldn't look. So
yes, you don't want to get busted actually sitting on the
I know. But I have occasionally broken into it and said, look, I've had to break into it to say this, and now I'm going off again, which always makes you look a bit pathetic. But there's always one really important thing. You think, oh, sod it, now I'm going to have to comment on that.
And speaking of social media, do you think that having older kids is perhaps harder than having babies?
Well, teenagers are definitely more complicated than toddlers, I can promise you that. So anyone who thinks they've got it hard with a 2-year-old doesn't know anything to say. But anyway, I don't think having older children has been a factor in my decision to leave Fawcett. I think juggling work and children for 29 years has been a factor. I'm just tired of it, and it's not many people do it for that long. I've gone round the circuit twice, literally, and without, necessarily when you started out in life planning to do that. I always thought I'd have 2, I never thought I'd have 4. And although my second 2 were very much planned and wanted, and it was all part of the plan once I'd met Mark, and that's absolutely fine. It's just, that knowing that you're entering to this again, and that this is another life commitment, and actually, I'll be, how old will I be? Another 10 years before Alex is going to be an adult, so I'll be 60. That's quite a long time from the age of 21 when I had Rachel all the way through to then to be juggling work and kids. So I think that's been a factor for me, just feeling a bit weary of that, lacking that ability to really find the off switch while you're doing the job, I think is a factor for me.
Do you think women have that problem more than men?
I don't know about in terms of that obsessiveness. I'm sure there are, men who are just as obsessive as women. I don't think that's a sort of gender thing particularly. But I think what women perhaps will tend to do, partly because they're conditioned to do it, is to feel worried for and about things, and to worry about their own performance a bit more than perhaps men will worry about. They'll be more self-critical, definitely. And I think I'm much less self-critical now than I was in my previous duties at role, for example. I think I've learnt not to be, and I've kind of learnt to accept my weaknesses and my mistakes and learn from them, and not beat myself up for them, and to be kind of open about them and just saying, do you know what? Yeah, I did get that wrong, and that's so what? Who doesn't get something wrong? So, but I think to get to that place of confidence in yourself and maturity to be able to say, you're big enough to say you got something wrong and it isn't going to be the end of the world. It's really hard to get to that point, and it's hard for women to get to that point because that expectation of perfection is kind of built in, and you see it in girls now. The expectation they've got to get, grade A's or do the perfect piece of work or to look perfect, all the kind of judging on your appearance. We know that young girls have. That's a massive, massive societal pressure that we place on them. So yeah, I do think that's very much gendered, and that contributes to that sense of guilt and failure that women feel all the time because they feel they're not doing the mothering perfectly and they're not doing the job perfectly. And actually, I've certainly learned to do both imperfectly, and I know I've done them both imperfectly, and accept myself and accept those limitations, and I don't care what other people think of me anymore. I just don't. It doesn't bother me. But it has taken a lot of life lessons and steps to get to that point. But it's also quite liberating, and you can just kind of free yourself up from so much if you just think, well, they think I'm not being a good mother, well, so what? I know I am, or I know I'm doing the best I can, or actually maybe I've done that wrong, but maybe I'll do better tomorrow. It's not the kind of all or nothing that everyone kind of makes it out to be.
Yeah, I definitely know I'm really hard on myself all the time. Looking back, you've had children for a long time now. How do you think that childcare in our country works? We've got a little boy and we can just about afford childcare for him. I'm just not sure how people do it when they have 2 or 3 kids.
Often 2 children tips women out of the labour market because it's just not cost effective anymore. It tends to be mothers tend to use their salary to pay for the childcare. So, often you'll hear women say, well, it's eaten up all my money. I've got no money left because all my money's gone on childcare. And the model we've got, the model of funding we've got, which is proving, and again, in this COVID crisis, you can see it unravelling, is because parents pay such a significant proportion of the childcare costs. So it's all passed on in the price that parents pay. If parents then are not putting their children into childcare because they were furloughed or lost their jobs, childminders and private provision just hasn't got money coming in, so that their whole income stream's disappeared. That means that they're facing closure. A lot of these places literally are facing closure. I think 1 in 4 would go bankrupt, is the IFS stuff today that they've just published. How can we run an economy with parents expected to work with a childcare infrastructure that looks and feels like that?
What do you think should happen?
Well, we need a short-term bailout. We need bridging funding to go to those providers to keep them going until employment picks back up again, because we don't know, because it's all driven by parental demand. We don't know how many of those parents are going to walk back in the door and want that childcare when the economy picks up again. So we need those providers to still be there to do it, to respond to that demand. And then we need a strategy for long-term childcare provision. We need an infrastructure investment strategy for childcare, which actually starts to think about it as a service that we rely on, like we do with the healthcare service, and that we just invest in a proper state-funded provision, which includes some parental contribution. I'm not arguing that it should all be free at the point of use. I think that would be a very radical solution. Most parents would expect to pay something, right? Let's be honest. So, but it's about how you balance the share of the cost, and also how you think about the quality of that provision, because we don't want to have a cheap system that offers poor quality childcare. We want a system that thinks about that early years education provision, the role that early years plays in terms of child development, right? So it has to be good quality as well. So that doesn't come cheap, and professionalising the childcare service, investing in that so it's good quality provision that parents can rely on and can afford. That requires a state-funded solution, but also with contributions from parents and probably also from employers too.
You're clearly really passionate about these issues still. Now that you're standing down, do you think it will be a complete break, or will you find something else to do pretty quickly?
I'm not going to suddenly go and change my direction in life so much that I move away from causes I care about. But I think it is the right thing for the organisation. And then in terms of the children, I think it's the right thing for them too. I think one thing I've learned from the first time round is actually this transition into teenagehood is a really important one, and I want to be around a little bit more for that. And it's about emotionally and mentally being present as well as physically being present. It's not feeling distracted by the emails and the Twitter messages and the WhatsApp messages when you're supposed to be in a conversation with your 12-year-old.
You've obviously done this twice, and I'm totally in awe. What are your top tips?
Well, my top tips would be, firstly, in terms of the conversation at home with a partner, is to try to at least anticipate some of these scenarios, whether it be, if the child's ill, drop off and pick up, who's packing the packed lunch if the kid's going off to school, whatever it might be, who's doing what, and try to have some of that negotiated up front, so you are consciously sharing it and you're making some of those tasks visible to the other person, because if they're not doing them, they won't be seeing them, they won't be thinking about them. But often we all know that they still need to be done. So, that sometimes it can just be assumptions and communication and misunderstanding that lead to resentment and inequality, really, in that then those behaviours persist because we just carry on doing it. When it comes to conversation with your employer, I would say, again, just be really clear about what those constraints are. Try to, demonstrate that you're thinking about the work of the organisation when you're negotiating any flexible arrangements. So, understand from the employer's perspective they're still going to get the job done, and demonstrate how within what you're proposing you can do that job. And that's perfectly reasonable as a sort of flexible working negotiation. And then thirdly, I would say try to give yourself a bit of slack. Try to be forgiving of yourself. Forgive yourself for things not going right. Forgive yourself for, the baby crying when you drop them off the first time. They all do, and they always will. Because obviously that's going to be hard, but you can get through that, and it will get better. So definitely cut yourself some slack. Be forgiving. And guilt is a destructive emotion, right? It's not a constructive thing. So it doesn't give you anything. It just takes from you, because you need your energy, you need your strength to do what you've got to do. It's a hard task, juggling all these things. You've got to find a way to ditch the guilt. And I think, I just very consciously decided I wasn't going to feel guilty anymore. And actually, when I let it go, and I knew I didn't have to. It was not a choice, but it was something that was happening to me, and I could kind of keep it at bay. Then that was quite liberating.
One of the things that struck me about my conversation with Sam is that maybe my own thoughts about someone leaving a job. Oh, what's wrong? What's happened? Has there been some kind of failure? Or that it's a negative thing, stepping down from a role. But actually, Sam's decision to leave the Fawcett Society could be seen as a really positive thing. It could be about self-care, as she said, and actually just taking some time away to think what you want to do next. Sam's got 4 kids and has been juggling childcare with busy jobs for 25 years. Maybe she deserves a break and a bit of time for herself to think, what do I want to do next? I guess it makes me consider how we view careers. We're not necessarily on this treadmill forever, working hard every day, looking after our kids, getting absolutely exhausted. Maybe when the kids are a bit older, things can change and you can stop and think, what do I want to do now? Maybe I might want to retrain. And that's kind of food for thought for me, really. Whilst I love my job at the moment, maybe in 10 years, 20 years, I will want to do something different. I will want to change my career. And perhaps we need to be open to that rather than seeing leaving a job as some kind of failure or negative situation. Next week, I'll be interviewing Bryony Gordon. She's a Telegraph columnist, best-selling author, and host of Bryony Gordon's Mad World podcast. Since having a child, her career seems to have gone from strength to strength, and I want to find out how on earth has she managed to write a book pretty much every year since having a baby. I also want to ask her about her views on mental health. Bryony's been really vocal on how we all need to talk to each other a lot more about how we're feeling and how she's suffered from OCD and depression. I want to find out whether these issues have got worse for her since having a child or whether perhaps they've got better. Subscribe to this feed to make sure you don't miss it. I'd love to hear your stories, so if you'd like to share them, click on the link in the episode description. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please do consider supporting our journalism by taking out a Telegraph subscription. You can get your first 30 days for free at telegraph.co.uk/audio.